The dresser had been there long enough to leave its signature in the floor. Clementine Kimball noticed the grooves on the first morning she crouched down to measure the wall, running 2 fingers along the shallow impressions pressed into the old hardwood. Not scratches, not damage from moving furniture carelessly. These were the marks of something so heavy, kept so still for so long, that the wood beneath it had simply surrendered to the fact of it. She stayed crouched there longer than the task required, tracing the curves where each foot had sunk. Years, she thought, maybe decades, the kind of time that changed the shape of things without anyone noticing until it was too late to notice anything else. The dresser itself was massive. Dark oak, the surface clouded with old wax and older dust, a cracked mirror attached to the top frame in a way that suggested someone had repaired it once and stopped caring whether it stayed repaired. 3 of the 4 drawer handles were missing entirely, the remaining one tarnished past any honest hope of restoration. It had been left behind by whoever lived in this house before the bank took it, and before the county took it from the bank, and before the tax lien office listed it among properties no one in any official capacity wanted to think about. Clementine had thought about it. She had read the listing 3 times sitting in the county clerk's office on her lunch break. The printout folded and refolded until the paper had gone soft as old cloth, because that was what happened when you had 45 minutes and a piece of paper that might mean something or might mean nothing at all, and no particular place to be except back at the desk where claims came in at a volume that did not care about your life. The property at 14 Aldercroft Road, single-family dwelling, 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, built approximately 1941, outstanding tax balance $4,200, current condition unknown. She had sat with that phrase for 2 weeks before she drove out to look. Current condition unknown, not uninhabitable, not condemned, not beyond saving. Unknown, which meant nobody had decided yet, which meant the question was still open, which meant that in the gap between what the county knew and what was actually true, there was possibly room for something. Clementine did not tell her sister she was going. She did not tell her co-worker Sharon, who would have suggested she put the money toward a real security deposit somewhere reasonable. She drove out on a Thursday evening after her shift at the medical billing office, still in her work clothes, with her 3-year-old daughter Vera asleep in the back seat, one cheek pressed warm against the window glass. She was 32 years old. She had $912 in savings. She had a lease ending in 6 weeks and a landlord who had told her, almost apologetically, almost kindly, the way people delivered bad news when they wanted credit for the gentleness of the delivery, that the rent was going up $240 a month because the market supported it. She had a job that paid $22 an hour. She had Vera, who needed stable ground beneath her feet more than she needed anything else in the world. The house at the end of the gravel driveway looked like exactly what it was. The porch roof sagged on the left side, where the support post had given out, pulling away from the house at an angle that suggested years of slow surrender. 2 windows were boarded. The yard had gone entirely to seed wild grass, pressing up against the foundation with the confidence of something that had stopped being challenged. Along the eastern edge of the property, a tree had fallen so long ago that smaller trees were growing out of its rotted trunk. The mailbox at the end of the drive leaned at a 40-degree angle, its door hanging open, its flag snapped off at some point nobody had witnessed. Clementine sat in her car with the engine running and looked at the house for a long time. Vera slept. The October light went flat and then gray. $4,200. She drove home with Vera still sleeping and spent the next week on the phone with everyone she trusted to pick up. She called her mother, she called her sister Josephine, she called her friend Adelaide, who had said years ago, "Call me if you ever really need something," in the tone that meant she had meant it. She called the credit union about a personal loan. She talked to her tax preparer about a refund advance. She sold her grandmother's pearl earrings on a resale app for $230 and felt sick about it for a full day, then felt something harder than sick settle into the place where the sick had been. Something that did not have a clean name, but that functioned like resolve. 6 days before the tax lien deadline, she had $4,380 assembled from 9 different sources, and she drove to the county office on her lunch break with every document she had been told to bring, and she signed what needed to be signed. She owned a house. She had not yet told Josephine. The county clerk's office was a building that smelled of old carpet and photocopier toner, the particular institutional scent of places where paperwork lived and ambitions went to be processed into forms. Clementine arrived at 10 minutes after 9 on a Tuesday morning, Vera on her hip, the folder of documents under her arm. She did not see Virgil Bottoms at first. She was focused on the counter, on the clerk, on making sure she had everything in the right order. It was only when she stepped up to the window that she registered the man standing 2 positions down, watching her with the particular quality of attention that meant he had been watching her for longer than she had known he was there. I was somewhere around 50, broad across the shoulders, wearing a canvas jacket with the slight distress of a garment that had been used outdoors regularly rather than distressed deliberately. He had a folder thicker than hers, which she noticed because she noticed things like that. He looked at her the way certain men looked at women who showed up somewhere they had decided was their territory, not hostile exactly, but measuring. "First time at one of these," he said. "Not unfriendly, almost cordial. The cordiality was the problem." "No tea," Clementine said, which was not entirely true. He smiled at that, the smile of someone who had already decided what was true. "These tax sales, they look simple on paper. They're not. The houses nobody wants for a reason." He glanced down at Vera, then back up. "The one on Aldercroft, you know the foundation's never been inspected. County doesn't have to tell you that." Clementine looked at him for a moment. She placed her folder on the counter. "Thank you," she said, and turned back to the clerk. She filed her deposit 4 minutes before he completed his own paperwork. She did not look at him on the way out, but she felt his eyes follow her through the glass door and into the parking lot, and that feeling did not leave her for the rest of the morning. She learned his name 3 days later from a man named Herschel Pruitt. Herschel Pruitt had the quality of a man who had decided long ago that most things people worried about were not worth worrying about, and had been proved right often enough to be comfortable about it. He was 70 years old, and he lived at the end of Aldercroft Road in a house smaller than Clementine's, but more thoroughly repaired, and he knocked on her door on the second Tuesday after she moved in, carrying a thermos of coffee and no particular agenda. "Knew the Bellows family," he said when she opened the door. He said it the way people stated facts that they considered relevant without preamble. "Hiram and Millicent, Good people. Hiram built this house with his own hands. You can feel it if you know what you're feeling for. He walked the porch with her, pointing at things she had not yet identified as significant. The way the boards were fastened, the spacing of the support posts, the angle of the roof's pitch. Man didn't cut corners, Herschel said. Didn't believe in it. Said if you got the framing right, everything else was fixable. Said if you got it wrong, everything else would eventually fail. He tapped one of the porch columns with his knuckle. Framing on this house is still right. Before he left standing at the top of the porch steps with his thermos, he said, that man who was at the county office, Virgil Bottoms, you should know who he is. Clementine waited. Buys these places, tax sales, estate sales, bank foreclosures. Sits on them just long enough to flip them. He's done 3 houses on this road. Knocked them all down. Put up 2 storage units and a cell tower pad. Herschel looked out at the yard, at the wild grass, at the tree growing out of the fallen tree. He wanted this one. He's not the kind of man who takes it well when he doesn't get what he wants. He came down the steps. You see anything that doesn't feel right, you call me. I've been on this road 43 years. I know which cars belong and which ones don't. I was halfway to the road when he stopped and said, without turning around, Hiram would have been glad someone's in there. The house needed a person. Clementine stood on the porch and watched him walk away, and felt for the first time since she had signed the papers that she was not entirely alone in this. The first week in the house was an education in the distance between what a building looked like and what it actually was. The water ran when she turned the taps, which was something, but it ran the color of weak tea for the first several minutes each morning and carried a faint mineral smell like coins held in a closed fist. The electricity had been cut at the meter. Getting it restored cost her $160 she had not fully budgeted for, but Vera was afraid of the dark in a way that had never been a problem in their apartment where the city's light pressed through the curtains all night long. Here the darkness at night was complete and total, the kind that had weight and 3 years old, had no vocabulary for it. Clementine slept with a flashlight on the nightstand for the first 2 weeks. Josephine arrived on Saturday morning of the first weekend with her son Tyler, and a reluctance she wore openly like a coat she had not bothered to hang up. She walked through the house with her arms crossed and her professional eye moving from surface to surface, cataloging in the manner of someone who had spent 12 years in property management and had learned to see the worst case first, because the worst case was almost always what you were dealing with, and the sooner you named it, the sooner you could start doing something about it. Bathroom tile is separating from the wall, she said. That means moisture behind it, which means mold, probably. I know, Clementine said. Kitchen ceiling stain is the size of a dining table. I know. Something was living in the walls of the back bedroom. Not recently, but something. Josephine, her sister, stopped in the hallway and looked at her. The look had several things in it at once, exasperation and love, and the particular exhaustion of caring very much about someone who would not be redirected. Clementine, this is going to cost you more to fix than you have. We start in the kitchen and work outward, Clementine said. Where do you want to begin? They looked at each other. Then Josephine uncrossed her arms and said, Fine, show me the kitchen. They started there and worked outward over the following weeks. Clementine learned to use a putty knife. She learned the difference between a structural crack and a plaster crack, between water damage that had stopped and water damage that was still actively happening. She learned that beneath the layers of neglect, the house had been built with a quality of attention that was becoming harder to find. Tyler, who was 16 and had absorbed enough of his mother's vocabulary to use it instinctively, looked up at the ceiling joists in the basement on the third day and said, "Bones are solid." Josephine did not contradict him. Vera adapted the way children adapted, which was to say, without apparent effort and with complete commitment. By the end of the first week, she had mapped the property in her mind and established zones. The kitchen was for serious things. The backyard was hers. The old tree growing out of the fallen tree was a separate kingdom that required separate rules. She spent her afternoons in the tall grass identifying insects from a picture book she had checked out of the library, bringing specimens to Clementine on flat leaves held out like offerings. "Mummy, this one has spots." "Yes, it does." "Is that normal?" "Very normal." Okay, back to the yard. On the second Thursday of the second week, Clementine woke before Vera and stood at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee, watching the mist come off the grass. The house was quiet around her, with the quality of quiet that old houses had, not empty, but settled, the specific silence of wall that had absorbed decades of living and held it all. She had stopped thinking of the silence as absence. She had started thinking of it as presence. Then she saw the truck. It was parked at the foot of the driveway, dark blue, the engine off. Virgil Bottoms sat behind the wheel, not moving, not looking at the house in any obvious way, which was itself a kind of looking. Clementine watched him from behind the curtain. He sat there for 19 minutes by the clock on the microwave. Then he drove away. She did not call Herschel. She wrote down the time and the license plate on the notepad she kept by the phone, and then she stood at the window for another few minutes, thinking about what it meant when a man who had wanted something you now had chose to come and sit at the end of your driveway without knocking. It meant he was waiting for her to give up. She made a second cup of coffee and went back to work on the kitchen cabinet hinges. The day she found the wall she had been painting for 3 hours. It was a Sunday afternoon in the third week, the sky outside, a flat November gray, Vera tasked with the important job of stirring the second can of paint, which was a responsibility they both pretended was real, because the pretending was part of what made the afternoon work. Clementine was rolling the front room walls in a warm off-white she had chosen specifically because the previous color, a shade of yellow that had oxidized into something between bile and regret, was the first thing she intended to bury. She heard Vera's footsteps change. There was a pattern to the way her daughter moved through the house, fast and thumping when she was playing, slow and deliberate when she was investigating. The second pattern meant she had found something. Clementine kept her roller moving. Vera had a theory about every piece of furniture the previous owners had left behind, which was that it had been left specifically for her, and that her job was to figure out why. The investigation of furniture was a regular feature of their days. "Mom?" Clementine turned her roller. "Mom?" There was something different in the second call. Not alarm, not fear, a different quality, entirely one, that made Clementine set the roller carefully in the tray and walk down the hallway. Vera was standing in the main bedroom with both palms pressed flat against the side of the enormous oak dresser, pushing. The dresser had moved perhaps 2 inches from the south wall, enough to reveal a sliver of plaster that had been hidden behind it. The wallpaper that covered the rest of the room's walls was absent from this section. The plaster here was bare, slightly yellowed with age, and on it, written in a dark ink that had dried over the years to the color of old rust, were lines of text. Careful, even lines, the hand of someone who had taken time. Clementine sat down on the floor. Her knees did a thing they sometimes did when something struck her from the direction she had not been watching, a kind of sudden hollowing, a brief evacuation of structural confidence. She sat on the dusty floorboards of a house she had paid $4,380 to own, and looked at handwriting that had been hidden behind a massive oak dresser for long enough that the plaster around it had changed color, and she felt the specific vertigo of standing at the edge of something whose depth she could not yet measure. Vera sat down beside her. She had learned in 3 years of watching her mother move through the world when to be quiet. The writing began near the top of the exposed section and continued in neat rows down to just above the baseboard. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible, still carrying whatever they had carried when they were written. Clementine read the first line twice without moving. To whoever lives here after us, I hope this finds you in better times than we left. Vera was watching her face the way small children watched their mothers' faces when they were trying to understand what something meant. "Mum, what does it say?" Clementine did not answer immediately. She was reading the way you read something that reorganized things as it went, each line shifting the weight of what came before it. "My name is Millicent Bellows. I lived in this house from 1941 until 1974. 33 years, which is most of my life on this earth. My husband Hiram built this house with his hands and the help of his brother Frank, who drove down from Pittsburgh to help frame the walls. Hiram was particular about the framing. He said if you got it right, everything else could be fixed, but if you got it wrong, everything else would eventually fail. I have thought about that often." Clementine's hand rose to her mouth and stayed there for a moment. "We raised 3 children here, Helena, Roland, and Wendell. Helena moved to Phoenix in 1966 when she married. Roland died in 1969. He was 22 years old. If you know the years, you will know why. I will not write more about that here, because some grief does not reduce to sentences. Wendell still lives in Millbrook County as of this writing. He and his wife have a dairy farm on the Route 7 corridor. I am writing this in 1974, which is the year Hiram passed, and the year I have decided I cannot maintain this house alone. I am moving to be near Helena in Phoenix. I do not know what will happen to this house. I have tried to sell it properly, but the market is poor, and the one offer I received felt less like an offer and more like an insult to everything Hiram built. I could not accept it. So I am leaving it in the hands of whatever comes next. There are things I want whoever comes next to know." Clementine stopped reading. She pressed her fist against her sternum for a moment, feeling her own heartbeat steady and uninstructed. She was 32 years old, and she had signed papers on a house she could barely afford with borrowed money and a quality of stubbornness that her sister named plainly and her mother named otherwise, and she was sitting on a dusty floor reading a dead woman's handwriting, and the dead woman was writing to her. Not to her specifically, to whoever, which turned out to be her. Vera put her hand flat against Clementine's collarbone, the way she did when she wanted to feel her mother's heart beat. They sat there together in the dust and the November gray light, while Clementine read the rest of what Millicent had written. About the false panel in the east wall of the root cellar built by Hiram in 1943, and how it opened if you pressed the lower left corner, about the cavity behind the baseboard on the left side of where the dresser stood accessible by pressing the trim piece and what Hiram had put there over the years. Important documents. Money during hard times when the bank felt less trustworthy than their own walls. His army discharge papers. Letters from Millicent's mother sent from Germany before the war. When I leave this house, I am leaving several things in that space. I am doing this partly because some of them have nowhere else to go, and partly because I have a feeling, not rational, but which I trust anyway, that they may matter to someone some day, in ways I cannot predict. I have left a record of everything in the blue tin on the dresser top. You will need the record to understand what you have found. Clementine looked up at the dresser. At the surface of the dresser, there was a circular outline in the dust, faint but unmistakable, the ghost of something that had sat in one place, long enough to leave its shape behind. The tin itself was gone. Her stomach dropped. Something had been there, had been part of what Millicent had prepared, and it was gone. Someone had been in this house at some point in the 50 years since Millicent walked out the front door and driven to Phoenix, and they had taken the record, but left everything else, and that meant either they had not known what else there was, or they had not cared, or they had taken only what they could see, and left what was hidden because they had not known to look. She pushed that thought aside and kept reading. I know I am writing to a stranger, maybe many strangers in sequence. Houses collect people and people leave, and what remains is the impression of them, the way weight leaves impressions in floorboards. If you are reading this, you are sleeping in the rooms where my children grew up. You are walking on the floors. Here I'm leveled by hand with a spirit level he ordered from a catalog in 1940. The kitchen window that faces east shows the sunrise in a particular way in early November. A low orange light that fills the whole room for about 40 minutes. I would like you to know that existed so that someone, even a stranger, will remember to look for it. I hope the house has been good to you. I hope the framing held. I hope you were kind to it and it returned the favor, because that is how houses work, the same as most things. If what is behind the wall is still there, and I believe it will be because I believe in walls built with intention, I want you to have it, all of it, without condition. You are living in this house, and that makes it yours in the way that matters. Good luck to you, Millicent H. Bellows, September 1918. Vera, who had been very quiet for a very long time, said, "What's behind the wall, Mommy? I don't know yet. Are we going to look?" Clementine sat for a moment longer, one hand on the floor, one hand still resting over her daughter's hand at her collarbone. Outside, the November light was going the color of old pewter, and the house around them was as still as a held breath. "Yes," she said, "we are." She stood up. Her knees were dusty. Her hands still carried faint traces of the off-white paint she had been rolling when Vera called her. She looked at the baseboard on the left side of where the dresser stood, and she pressed the trim piece at the lower corner as Millicent had written. Nothing happened immediately. She pressed harder. She felt it then, a give in the wood, the small, unmistakable compression of something designed to yield to pressure. The trim piece pivoted on a hidden axis, revealing a small metal latch, painted over so many times in the decades since Hiram had set it there that it had almost become part of the wall. Clementine worked it with her fingernail, and then with a flat screwdriver from the kitchen drawer, and after several careful minutes it turned. A section of baseboard and plaster, perhaps 18 inches wide and 2 feet tall, swung inward on its hidden hinges. The space behind it was dark and smelled of old wood and settled time. Clementine held her phone's flashlight into the cavity and looked. The bundle of letters was there tied with kitchen string that had dried to the stiffness of wire, the paper brown at the edges but structurally sound. The handwriting on the topmost envelope was European in its character, the particular formation of someone who had learned to write in a language other than English before they learned to write in it. The return address on the envelope was a German city. The wooden box was there small and undecorated, its brass clasp still turning. Inside, pressed into velvet that had deteriorated to a loose weave of darkened fiber, were 6 coins, old. The surfaces worn smooth in places. The faces bearing images that were not American, the profiles of figures she did not recognize. They were the size of silver dollars. They were not silver dollars. The canvas pouch was there pulled shut, with a drawstring that had stiffened over the decades, but still held its knot. Clementine worked the string open with careful fingers. She tilted the pouch and let what was inside slide into her palm. 18 pieces, each approximately the size of a poker chip, each carrying the deep, unmistakable yellow of something that was not brass, not gold, tinted, not decorative reproduction. They were irregular. Their edges were not machine cut. They were the kind of thing shaped by a process older than minting by heat and pressure, and human hands by someone who had taken raw material and reduced it to this. Clementine sat back on her heels. Vera peered around her shoulder. "Mommy, are those treasure?" Clementine closed her fingers carefully around the pieces in her palm. The weight of them was significant. The warmth they had already absorbed from her skin was immediate. "Maybe," she said, "we're going to find out." She replaced everything exactly as she had found it. The canvas pouch, the wooden box, the bundle of letters. She needed an effort of will she had not anticipated, needing to put those things back into the dark and close the small door and turn the latch and replace the trim piece and step back and look at the wall as if nothing had changed. Then she took out her phone and photographed every line of Millicent Bellows's handwriting methodically from the first word to the signature. She photographed the baseboard, the wall, the exposed section, the cracked mirror of the dresser, the grooves in the floor where the dresser's feet had rested for so long they had left their shape in the wood. She did this because documentation was what careful people did when they encountered something they did not yet understand. Then she put Vera to bed, sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and began to think. She did not sleep. She lay in the room beside Vera, staring at the ceiling with the flashlight on the nightstand and the darkness of the property pressing against the windows, and she thought about a woman named Millicent Bellows sitting in this same house in September of 1974, pressing ink into plaster with the calm deliberateness of someone who understood that the words might wait longer than she could imagine before they reached anyone at all. Millicent had been right to trust the walls. The walls had kept everything. What Clementine had not been able to determine lying there in the dark, with the slow rhythm of the house around her, was whether the person who had taken the blue tin from the dresser top had known what else was in the house, or whether they had simply seen an object, taken it, and left without understanding that the object was only the index, the record of the thing, not the thing itself. She decided it did not matter. What mattered was that the cavity was intact. What mattered was that she was the one who had found it. By 5:30 in the morning, She was at the kitchen table with her second cup of tea and her phone running searches with the focused efficiency of someone who had worked in medical billing long enough to know that the difference between the right terminology and the wrong one was the difference between getting an answer and getting nothing. She searched the coins first. The images she had taken were not professional quality, but they were clear enough to show the obverse and reverse of each piece in the wooden box. She ran them through an image search, then followed the results to a collector forum that appeared in the third link. Within 40 minutes, she had enough to understand that she was looking at something that required a different category of expertise than she currently possessed, and that the next step was not more searching, but a specific kind of human being in a specific kind of room. She called Josephine at 7:15. "I need you to take Vera for 2 days," she said. Josephine was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the particular alertness of someone who had been partly expecting a call like this. "What did you find?" "Something I need to have evaluated. I don't know what it is yet." "Clementine, I'll tell you everything when I know something. Right now, I just need you to take her." Josephine arrived at noon and stood at the door for a moment, looking at her sister with an expression that held several things at once, none of which she said out loud. Vera went without argument, carrying her picture book and her wooden rabbit and a bag of crackers, walking to her aunt's car with the confidence of a child who had never had reason to doubt that the adults around her would sort out whatever needed sorting. Clementine watched the car back down the driveway and disappear around the curve. Then she went inside and got the wooden box. She had lined a shoe box with the softest cloth she could find, an old flannel shirt that had been serving as a cleaning rag, and placed the wooden box in the center and the canvas pouch beside it. The letters she put in a separate, smaller box, not because she had been told to, but because she understood instinctively that they were a different kind of discovery and deserved different handling. She drove to the county seat, because that was where Alden Crane had his shop. She had found his name on the collector forum the night before, mentioned twice in threads about estate appraisals, both times in a tone that suggested competence rather than celebrity. The shop occupied the ground floor of a Victorian building on the main commercial block, its window dressed with coins behind glass and a hand-painted sign that read, "Alden Crane Estate Appraisals and Numismatic Evaluation Established, 1978. Alden himself was in his late 60s, methodical and unhurried, in the manner of a man who had spent 40 years looking at small objects through magnifying equipment and had stopped being surprised by most things. He wore a jeweler's loop on a cord around his neck and reading glasses on top of his head, and a third pair on his nose, which suggested a philosophical relationship with the problem of seeing clearly. He greeted her from behind the glass counter and said, "What can I do for you?" She told him she had found some coins in an old house she had recently acquired and needed to understand what she had. She set the wooden box on the counter. She did not tell him about the gold pieces yet. She had decided to let the coins go first, to see how the first conversation shaped itself before she showed the second thing. Alden lifted the lid. He looked at the 6 coins in their velvet setting and was quiet for a moment in a way that was professionally neutral, but that Clementine noticed because she noticed things like that. He lifted the loop to his eye and examined each coin individually, turning them, holding them at angles to the overhead light, setting them back without stacking them. When he had looked at all 6, he set the loop down and folded his hands on the counter. "Where did you say you found these?" "Inside a wall cavity. The house was built in near 41. Do you have any documentation about the property, previous ownership?" Clementine showed him the photographs on her phone, scrolling through Millicent's letter slowly enough for him to read. He read carefully, asking her to go back twice over the section describing the cavity and its contents. When he finished, he was quiet for another moment. Then he explained what he was looking at. The St. Gaudens double eagle was a $20 gold coin minted between 1900 and 1933, named for the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, who had designed the obverse, a figure of Lady Liberty in motion that many considered the finest coin design the United States Mint had ever produced. In 1933, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which required the surrender of gold coins to the Federal Reserve. The majority of St. Gaudens double eagles in existence at that time were melted down. The coins that were not surrendered, kept by families who did not trust the order or did not hear about it, or simply made a private decision about what was theirs, became something else over the following decades, scarce, historically significant, tracked individually by collectors with an attention that had nothing to do with their original face value of $20. Alden spent 45 minutes with the coins under a proper loupe and a light table he brought out from the back, making notes in a leather-bound ledger with the economy of someone writing for himself rather than for anyone else. Clementine sat in a chair near the window and watched the street outside, and told herself that the sounds he made meant nothing until he came back and told her what they meant. When he returned to the counter, his expression was composed, but there was something working underneath it, the face of a man holding something in that he would normally let out. "Based on my assessment," he said, "these 6 coins are genuine St. Gaudens double eagles." He named the specific dates and mint marks. He said their condition was in the range of extremely fine to about uncirculated given the storage circumstances. He said that for a definitive valuation on a set of this quality, she should see a colleague of his in the city, a man named Redford Drew, who handled major estate pieces. And he said that his preliminary estimate, which he should treat as non-binding, was that the 6 coins together could represent somewhere in the range of $60,000 to $90,000 at auction, depending on specific varieties and professional grading. Clementine was quiet. Alden waited. She said, "There's something else." She put the canvas pouch on the counter. Alden tested the gold pieces the way a man tested things when he already had a strong suspicion and was looking for confirmation rather than discovery. He had a small scale under the counter and a touchstone and a set of testing solutions, and he worked through the process with the same unhurried precision he had brought to the coins, explaining as he went that the mark left on the touchstone by the acid solution indicated purity, and that what he was seeing was consistent with gold refined privately rather than commercially, somewhere in the range of 90 to 92% pure. He weighed everything. He did the arithmetic in his ledger. He told her the total troy weight. He told her the spot price of gold that morning and what to multiply it by and what to account for in terms of purity. And then he said that the result was a conservative floor, because raw pieces in this condition with this kind of history carried collector value on top of melt value, and that he was not the right person to quantify that premium. He picked up the phone on his counter and called Radford Drew in the city without asking whether she wanted him to. Clementine sat in the chair by the window and did the arithmetic on her own phone while he made the call. She did it twice. She sat with the number for a long moment, not moving, not speaking, while the clock on Alden's wall measured out ordinary seconds at its ordinary rate, completely indifferent to what had just shifted in the room. She was still sitting with it when the door opened. The man who stepped in was not a customer. She could tell that immediately. Customers came in with a certain quality of purposefulness, heading toward the counter, the cases, the specific thing they had come to see. This man came in and stopped 3 steps inside the door and looked at Clementine. He was somewhere around 50, wearing a canvas jacket, the kind of face that had spent time outdoors and had organized itself around that. He said he was an independent collector and that he understood she had just come into some interesting material and that he could offer her a fair price today, cash, no paperwork necessary. Clementine looked at him steadily. "Who told you I was here?" He smiled the smile of a man who had prepared for this question. "This is a small community. Word travels. What's your name?" A pause that lasted 1 beat too long. "Mitchell Crane." Clementine stood up. She picked up her shoebox. She looked at the man and said, "I'm not selling anything today." She walked past him to the door and out into the afternoon. She sat in her car for 3 full minutes before she started the engine. Her hands were steady on the wheel. The rest of her was working through something that had not finished working yet. She knew one thing with certainty that she had not known an hour ago. Virgil Bottoms had not come to sit at the end of her driveway because he was the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. He had been watching her, waiting to see what she found, and now someone had been dispatched to intercept what she had found before she understood what it was worth. She pulled out of the parking space and pointed the car north toward the city, toward Radford Drew. The drive was 2 hours. She made it in 1 hour and 50 minutes, the shoebox on the passenger seat in a shaft of late afternoon light, her mind moving through the conversation with Alden in a way that was not excitement exactly, not yet, because she had learned to be careful with hope in the years since Vera's father had stopped being the person she was building a life toward. Hope was how you got hurt, but the thing that replaced hope when you disciplined it out of yourself was not nothing. It was something more structural, a readiness to act accurately when the information warranted it, without the distortion of wanting a particular outcome so badly that you bent the facts toward it. Clementine had that quality. She had built it. Radford Drew's office did not look like Alden Crane's shop. It had climate-controlled display cases in a waiting area that resembled a private library, more than a commercial space, warm wood and specific lighting, and the hush of a place where significant transactions had been conducted quietly for a long time. He had been called ahead. He was ready for her. He spent 2 hours with the coins. He spent another hour with the gold pieces. He had equipment that Alden did not have, and credentials from institutions whose names appeared in the Collector Forum threads. Clementine had read the night before, always in the same tone, the name that meant you had reached the end of the chain, the person past whom there was no higher authority to consult. When he came to sit across from her at the table in his back office, his face was professionally composed. He had the bearing of a man who had delivered significant information to people across this table many times and had learned that the delivery was its own skill distinct from the information itself. He confirmed everything Alden had told her, and then he showed her a document he had printed during his evaluation. Among the 6 coins, there was one he needed her to understand specifically: a particular year, a particular mint, a production run that had begun and been stopped by the executive order before most of the coins reached circulation, leaving a number so small that the surviving examples were individually tracked, appearing at major auction houses at intervals measured in years rather than months, the results reported in specialist publications the way significant transfers of art were reported. He showed her the most recent comparable sale. He let her look at the number. Then he told her that the coin she had found in the condition she had brought him, based on that comparable, warranted its own line. He wrote a number on the paper in front of her. Clementine looked at it. She said, "I need a minute." Radford Drew said, "Of course, take all the time you need." He stood and left the room with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the room needed to belong to her for a moment. She heard him speaking to someone at the front of the shop, the low professional murmur, carrying without the words the sound of ordinary business proceeding at a normal volume, while the air in the back office held the specific weight of a number that had not yet finished arriving. She looked at it again. Then she picked up the pen he had left and did the arithmetic for the complete collection, using the ranges he had given her for the 5 remaining coins and the figures Alden had calculated for the gold pieces, and she wrote the total at the bottom of the page. It was an estimate. It would require professional grading and auction confirmation, and a process that would take months. It could shift in either direction by amounts that mattered. But at its most conservative calculation, it was more money than her mother had earned across her entire working life. Radford came back to the room. He sat down. He looked at the number she had written at the bottom and did not comment on it, which was its own kind of confirmation. She said the letters, the German correspondence. He told her he was not the right person to evaluate those, but that he knew who was. Pre-war correspondence from Germany to the United States, particularly from the period between the wars and the early years of the second one, had been the subject of significant archival attention in recent years. The value of such letters depended on content and condition, and the specific circumstances of the correspondence, and she needed someone with the appropriate expertise. He gave her a name, Dr. Ursula Wendt, a historian at a university 40 miles from her house. He said one more thing before she left. He said that whatever she decided to do with what she had found, she needed to speak to a lawyer before she moved any further, not because there was any doubt about her ownership, which was established by her deed, but because the process of converting historical assets into realized wealth had steps and safeguards, and the people who helped navigate that process included some who were genuinely helpful and some who were not, and that the difference mattered more than most people understood until it was too late. She thanked him. She packed the shoebox. She shook his hand and walked out into the late afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the ordinary city air move around her. Then she called Adelaide Yarborough. Adelaide had been 2 years ahead of Clementine in high school, the kind of person whose presence had always registered as quietly capable without being loud about it. They had not been close then. They had been the kind of parallel acquaintances who recognized each other at school functions and nodded, two lives running in the same geography, without touching. Clementine had gotten her number from her mother, who had gotten it from a woman at her church who said Adelaide had handled her nephew's estate and done it right, which in her mother's community was the highest available endorsement. Adelaide's office was on the second floor above a dry cleaner on the main commercial street of the county seat. She listened to everything Clementine told her without interrupting, holding her coffee mug in both hands. Her notepad face down on the desk, because she was the kind of person who did not need to write while listening only after. When Clementine finished, Adelaide said, "Let me make sure I have this correctly. You purchased the property at tax auction. You have the deed in your name. The property was listed and assessed and transferred with no competing claims on record." Yes, and the items were found within the physical structure of the property inside a sealed cavity in an interior wall with written documentation from the original owner expressly conveying them to whoever occupied the house after her. Yes, Adelaide wrote something in her small, precise script. The deed is the foundation. Anything affixed to or concealed within the physical structure at the time of purchase transfers with the property absent a specific prior claim. Millicent's letter is not a legal instrument in the technical sense, but it establishes intent and provenance, which matters significantly for the authentication process. She set her pen down. Has anyone else seen the cavity or the items? Vera, she's 3. The corner of Adelaide's mouth moved. Anyone else? No, I photographed everything before I moved anything. I told my sister there was a find, but not what specifically. Good. Keep it that way for now. She leaned forward slightly. There are 3 things that need to happen before you do anything else. The items need to go to a secure facility, not your car, not your house. You need to begin the formal authentication process with engagement letters and chain of custody documentation. And we need to establish your legal position in writing before anything goes to auction. She named what this would cost, which was less than Clementine had expected. The auction house fees and appraiser fees will come out of proceeds, standard practice for an estate-level find. Clementine had been writing in her own notepad. She looked up. There's also the German correspondence. Adelaide was quiet for a moment. A deliberate pause that Clementine had already learned was how she held space before complex information. That's its own expertise. Historical documents from that period involve a completely separate set of specialists and potentially a separate set of considerations. She did not say what she meant by considerations yet. I can give you a referral to Dr. Ursula Wendt. I know her work. She paused again. Millicent's maiden name. Do you know it? Clementine thought about the letter. Millicent had signed it with her married name. The middle initial was H. No, she only gave her married name. The letter mentions her mother. Letters from Germany. Adelaide was writing. If her mother was German-born and corresponded from Germany until the war made correspondence impossible, there may be a family history connected to those letters that matters for more than monetary reasons. She looked up. I'm not saying this to complicate things. I'm saying it because if those letters have historical significance, they may be wanted by archives and institutions in ways that have their own kind of value, and you should understand that before you make any decisions. Clementine drove home with 3 referrals, written in her notepad, and a legal engagement letter signed and in her folder. She sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside the house, lit by the early dark of November, the porch light she had installed in the second week casting a warm circle over the steps she had replaced with new boards that still showed their newness against the weathered wood around them. The house looked the same, she looked the same, the day felt ordinary in the way that days sometimes chose to behave after something extraordinary had happened inside them, as though the world needed time to absorb what had changed before it let you feel the full shape of it. Dr. Ursula Wendt came to the secure facility 2 weeks later, once the coins and the gold pieces had been transported and logged. She brought cotton gloves and a macro lens camera and a magnifying loupe, and she sat at the examination table for 3 hours, while Clementine waited in the adjoining room with a book she did not read. She thought about the letters. She had not opened them herself. She had looked at the envelopes, the European handwriting, the German return address, the stamps. She had been unwilling to open them, not from incuriosity, but from something she could not fully articulate at the time, only that they felt like something that deserved the right hands before they were touched. The coins were objects accessible through the language of markets and rarity. The letters were voices. She thought about Millicent keeping them for 50 years and then choosing to leave them in the wall. When Dr. Wendt came out, her hands were in motion in the particular way of someone processing something that had moved through them rather than merely across them. She sat across from Clementine and folded her hands on the table. The letters span 1933 to 1941, she said. There are 23 of them. They are correspondence from a woman named Greta Stein to her daughter, who was Millicent Bellows' mother. She paused. Greta was Millicent's maternal grandmother. Millicent's mother emigrated to the United States in 1932. Greta chose to stay in Frankfurt. She did not say the rest immediately. She let the dates do their work. The correspondence documents Greta's years in Frankfurt as the political situation changed, her account of what she witnessed, her reports of what happened to people she knew. The final letter is dated October 1941. The room was quiet. Clementine understood what October 1941 meant for a Jewish woman in Frankfurt who had stayed. She did not need it explained. She had been born in 1991, and she had grown up knowing what that meant, and the knowledge sat in her chest now with a specific gravity. The last letter, Wendt continued carefully with the precision of someone who had spent a career learning that careful language was not evasion, but respect. Suggests that Greta understood what was coming. She wrote with that understanding. 23 letters. A woman writing to her daughter in America while the world she had lived in was being systematically destroyed around her. Writing anyway, saying what needed to be said, sending the words across the ocean with no certainty that they would arrive, no certainty of anything except the need to say them. Millicent had kept them for 50 years. She had kept them and then left them in the wall of the house her husband had built with the faith that whoever came next would be the right person to have them. Dr. Wendt placed the folder of photographs on the table between them. I want to ask about your intentions before I say anything else. Go ahead. These letters are historically significant in a way that exists entirely separately from their monetary value. They are primary source documents. They name individuals and locations and circumstances that are either unknown or only fragmentarily recorded. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, both would consider them of considerable importance. She met Clementine's eyes steadily. "I want to be honest with you about the monetary dimension as well. A complete collection of this kind authenticated in this condition would attract serious interest from private collectors. The institutional route typically means donation or loan, which carries tax implications, but not direct payment. The private route means sale." She paused. "You are under no obligation to choose the institutional route. They are your property. I am telling you this because I believe you are someone who would want to know everything that these letters are before you decide what to do with them." Clementine looked at the folder on the table. She thought about Greta Stein in Frankfurt in October of 1941, writing a letter to her daughter in America, knowing it might be the last one she would ever send, writing it anyway, saying what needed to be said with the understanding that it might travel through walls and years and arrive in the hands of strangers. She thought about Millicent writing behind a dresser, "I hope this finds you in better times than we left." She said, "What would the museum do with them?" Dr. Wendt said, "Preserve them permanently. Digitize them, translate them, make them part of the accessible record. They would be credited to Millicent's family and to you as the finder and donor. Historians, family researchers, educators would be able to access them." She held Clementine's gaze. "Greta Stein would be remembered, specifically by name, in a way that the existing archival record cannot currently do." Clementine was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Tell me about the tax implications." The coin auction was scheduled for late spring at a house in New York that handled major estate sales. The authentication process took 11 weeks. Adelaide coordinated the transport, the engagement letters, the chain of custody documentation. Clementine worked her regular shifts at the billing office and came home to Vera and made dinner and read picture books at bedtime and spent her evenings on the phone with Adelaide or driving 40 minutes to the city to check on the process. And the weeks passed with the ordinary indifference of time to the significance of what was moving through them. The grading service confirmed what Radford Drew had told her. The specialist who wrote the written assessment confirmed it. The auction house confirmed it and issued a consignment agreement that Adelaide reviewed line by line before Clementine signed. She drove to New York the day before the sale with Adelaide and checked into a hotel room that cost more per night than she spent on groceries in a week. She called Josephine from the hotel bed. "How do you feel?" Josephine asked. "Strange, like it isn't real, and also like it's the realest thing that's ever happened." Josephine was quiet for a moment. "Those two things can both be true at the same time." "I know." "You know what I keep thinking about," Josephine said. "What?" "Grandma's pearl earrings." Clementine had not expected that. The $230, the sick feeling, and then the harder thing that replaced it. "We're going to get them back," she said. "The listing is probably long gone. Then we'll find the person who bought them and buy them back at whatever they want." Josephine's voice carried the tone she used when a decision had already been made and she was simply informing reality of it. "Those earrings belong in this family." Clementine lay on the hotel bed, looking at the ceiling, and felt something move through her that was several things pressed close enough together to be indistinguishable: gratitude and grief, and the long tension of having been afraid for a very long time only beginning to release its hold. She slept better than she expected. The auction room was smaller than she had imagined. Rows of chairs, a bank of phones along one wall, the coins in a case at the front, each in its certified holder, the grade certificates visible through the cases. Adelaide sat beside her. Clementine wore the blazer she had bought at a consignment shop the week before, and had stopped worrying about it by the time they walked through the door. The bidding on the 5 standard coins moved at a pace that left her gripping the armrest each hammer fall, at a number that individually exceeded any single year of her working life. She kept her face still. Then the auctioneer announced the coin Redford Drew had circled in his office. He named the date and the mint and the grade, and cited the comparable sale. The room shifted in a subtle way, the particular quality of attention that came over people who understood what they were looking at. The bidding opened and moved and slowed and climbed past the comparable result, and the auctioneer said, with professional understatement, that they were in record territory for this piece, and then the hammer came down on a number that Clementine would remember with complete precision for the rest of her life. Adelaide wrote it on her notepad and turned it toward her. Clementine read it. She looked at the case at the front of the room, at the small coin in its certified holder that had sat in a wall on Aldercroft Road for more than 80 years, held there by Hiram Bellows' faith in his own construction, and she thought about a morning in October when she had sat in her car at the end of a weedy driveway with the engine running and $912 in her savings account, and a feeling she had not been able to name. She was still thinking about it 3 days after she came home, the auction behind her, Vera, back in the house, the November light coming through the east-facing kitchen window exactly as Millicent had written it, wood orange and low, and filling the whole room for 40 minutes, like something that had been waiting patiently to be witnessed when the envelope arrived in the mail. She did not recognize the return address. She opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a letter from an attorney named Morton Haney, representing a man named Montgomery Pemberton, who identified himself as a nephew of the Bellows family, and was formally asserting a legal claim to all items recovered from the physical structure of the property at 14 Aldercroft Road, on the grounds that they constituted family property improperly transferred. Clementine read the letter once, then she read it again. Then she called Adelaide. Adelaide's voice on the other end was even and unhurried. "I received a copy by fax 20 minutes ago. I've already begun pulling records." A pause. "The paperwork looks professional, but I want to verify the underlying claim before we respond to anything. Is it legitimate? I don't know yet." Another pause, this one deliberate. "But I can tell you that Morton Haney is an attorney who primarily represents real estate investment transactions in this county." She stopped. "Clementine, I need you to sit tight and let me work. This may be exactly what it appears to be, or it may be something else entirely." Clementine set the letter down on the kitchen table. Through the east window, the last of the November light was finishing its 40 minutes, and the room was returning to its ordinary gray. She thought about Virgil Bottoms sitting at the end of her driveway. She thought about the man in Alden Crane's shop who had known she was there before she had told anyone she was going. She thought about Millicent writing, "I believe in walls built with intention." The walls had held for 50 years, but now something was testing them from the outside, and Clementine did not yet know how strong the thing doing the testing actually was. The night after the letter arrived, Clementine sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Vera slept. The house was quiet in the way it was always quiet after dark, that deep, rural stillness that had frightened her daughter in the first weeks and had since become the sound of safety, of distance from everything that pressed. Clementine had stopped hearing it as absence. She no longer needed to think about that distinction. It had simply become true. The letter from Morton Haney's office sat on the table in front of her. She had read it 4 times. She knew it by memory now, the specific language of a legal document designed to sound more certain than it was, the particular weight of phrases like "hereby asserts" and "lawful entitlement," and all items, recovered phrases, that were meant to feel like walls closing in. She thought about what she had done, not defensively, not looking for reassurance. She thought about it the way she thought about everything she needed to understand clearly, with the particular honesty of a person who had learned that the gap between what you wanted to be true and what was actually true was exactly where mistakes lived. She had bought the house legally. She had the deed. She had Adelaide. She had Millicent's letter photographed and documented. She had done everything correctly from the moment she had found the cavity, and she knew it. And yet, she picked up her phone and called Josephine at 2:15 in the morning. Josephine answered on the second ring, which told Clementine that her sister had been lying in bed in the particular state of wakefulness that was not sleep, but was not fully conscious either, the state that parents and people who cared too much about other people carried through their nights. "Tell me," Josephine said. Clementine told her. The letter. Montgomery Pemberton, the attorney whose name Adelaide had recognized as belonging to a man who worked real estate investment transactions, the fact that Virgil Bottoms had been sitting at the end of her driveway long before she had found anything in the walls, which meant someone had believed there was something to find before she had found it. Josephine listened without interrupting. When Clementine finished, there was a silence. Not the silence of someone formulating a response, but of someone thinking. Then Josephine said, "Do you want to walk away? Or are you calling me at 2 in the morning because you don't want to walk away, and you need someone to tell you that's not crazy?" Clementine did not answer immediately. "Because those are 2 different conversations," Josephine said, "and I'm here for both of them, but I need to know which one we're having." Clementine looked at the letter on the table. She looked at the kitchen around her, at the cabinet doors she had rehung at the table she had found in the basement and sanded by hand until the grain came up clean and warm in the afternoon light. She looked at the east-facing window, dark now, the glass holding her own reflection back at her. "I don't want to walk away," she said. "Then don't." No hesitation, no preamble, just the flat certainty of someone who had already decided. "You have Adelaide, you have the deed, you have Millicent's letter, you have everything. This Pemberton person is testing whether you'll fold, and the answer is no." A pause. "Now go to sleep. You look terrible, even on the phone." Clementine laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came out of nowhere, and it was real, and it was the thing that finally released enough of the tension in her chest to let her breathe properly. She went to bed. She slept. Adelaide called at 9 the following morning with the voice of someone who had been working since before 7. "Montgomery Pemberton," she said, "has no verifiable connection to the Bellows family. She had spent 2 days pulling records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property histories, probate records going back to the 1940s in Millbrook County and the 2 counties adjacent. She had contacted the county where Millicent had lived in Phoenix and requested whatever estate documentation existed from her death in 1989. She had run Montgomery Pemberton's name through every relevant database available to her. Nothing. No birth record linking him to any Bellows family line. No documentation of any kind connecting him to Millicent or Hiram or their children, Helena Rowland or Wendell. The paperwork he had filed with his claim looked professionally prepared and carried the surface plausibility of a document assembled by someone familiar with the format of such things, but the underlying facts it claimed to represent did not exist. The family history it cited had been invented. The documents are fraudulent, Adelaide said. Well made, fraudulent, but fraudulent. Clementine was standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, and the attorney Morton Haney. I spoke with him this morning, off the record, because I have a professional relationship with him, and he understood the conversation he was in. He told me that his client was referred to him by a local property investor who had described the situation as a straightforward estate dispute. He said he was not aware that the supporting documentation was fabricated. A pause. I believe him. He's not a dishonest man. He was used by Virgil Bottoms. He did not name his referral source, but he described the investor in terms that were specific enough that I did not need him to. Clementine set her coffee down. She felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but carried elements of both the specific feeling of seeing a thing clearly after working for a long time to see it. What do? We document everything we have and we meet them. Adelaide's voice was steady. All of it, the deed, the chain of ownership, Millicent's letter, the authentication, records, the auction results, the legal transfer. We lay it on a table and we let Montgomery Pemberton and whoever is behind him understand what they are facing. She paused. And I need Herschel Pruitt. She had called Herschel that same afternoon, and he had driven over without asking many questions, which was consistent with everything she knew about him. He sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and listened to what Adelaide needed. He remembered the man with the pickup truck. He had told Clementine about it earlier that fall. What he had not told her then, because he had not yet understood its relevance, was that he had actually spoken to the man briefly, exchanged a few words at the end of the driveway. The man had asked about the house, whether anyone was taking care of it, whether there was a caretaker. Herschel had told him the house had been empty for years. The man had nodded and driven away. Did he say his name? Adelaide asked. No, but I remember the truck, I remember the plate was local. Herschel looked at his coffee. And I remember what he was carrying when he left. Small box, the kind you'd put documents in. Blue. Tin, I think. Tucked under his arm like he didn't want anyone to notice it. Clementine went still. The blue tin. Millicent's record of everything she had left in the cavity, the index without which a person who found the cavity would not know what they were looking at, or how much of it there was, or why any of it mattered. He took the record, Clementine said, but he didn't take anything else. Adelaide understood immediately, because he didn't know about the cavity itself. He found the tin on top of the dresser. He read the list. He knew something was hidden somewhere in the house, but not where or how to access it. So he waited. Herschel said he waited 30 years. People who work in distressed properties are patient when the potential return is large enough. Adelaide looked at Clementine. Virgil Bottoms has been working this county for 20 years. He knew about that house. He may have had the tin for a long time, may have gone through multiple attempts to acquire the property legally. When you got there first, he shifted his approach. It was the cleanest explanation. It accounted for everything: the presence at the auction, the truck at the end of the driveway, the man in Alden Crane's shop, and finally Montgomery Pemberton, a name assembled around fabricated paperwork, a last attempt to claim by intimidation what could not be claimed by law. Herschel looked at Clementine across the table. Hiram built that wall to keep things safe. It kept them safe. He was quiet for a moment. Man didn't get the framing wrong on anything. The meeting was held in Adelaide's office on a Thursday morning, 12 days after the letter had arrived. Montgomery Pemberton came with Morton Haney. Virgil Bottoms was not invited and was not present in the room, but when Clementine arrived, she saw his truck parked on the street 2 blocks away, and she understood that he had wanted to be close enough to know quickly. Pemberton was a man in his mid-40s with the particular quality of someone performing composure rather than feeling it, the jaw set a degree tighter than natural, the eyes moving to the documents on the table before they moved to Adelaide's face. Morton Haney, beside him, had the expression of a man who had spent the days since his conversation with Adelaide reassessing a situation he had entered in good faith and was now navigating carefully. Adelaide did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She placed the documents on the table in the order she had chosen, and walked through them one by one, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of someone who had done this before and understood that the pace itself was part of the argument. The deed, the auction record, the chain of ownership documentation from the county, Millicent's letter, the original photographs, the authentication chain, the legal opinion establishing that items concealed within the structure of a property transferred with that property at the time of sale. Then she placed the final document on the table, the results of her records search, the absence in every relevant database of any connection between Montgomery Pemberton and the Bellows family. She said, "I am prepared to refer this matter to the County District Attorney's Office for review of the fraudulent documentation filed in support of this claim. Alternatively, Mayor Pemberton can withdraw the claim today in writing, and we will consider the matter closed." The room was quiet. Morton Haney leaned toward his client and said something in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Pemberton sat without moving for a moment, and then something in his posture changed, a slight collapse in the constructed firmness, the way structures failed, not dramatically, but incrementally, the load-bearing element finally giving way. He withdrew the claim in writing before he left the building. Clementine stood at the window of Adelaide's office afterward and watched Virgil Bottoms's truck pull away from the street 2 blocks down. She watched it go around the corner and disappear, and she felt not triumph, which was what she had expected to feel, but something quieter, the specific relief of a door that had been rattling in its frame finally going still. Adelaide came to stand beside her. "It's done." "Yes," Clementine said. "All of it. The legal position is unambiguous. There is no remaining challenge." Adelaide paused. "You handled every part of this correctly from the beginning. That matters." Clementine thought about the night she had photographed Millicent's letter before she touched anything in the cavity. She had not known exactly why she was doing it at the time. She had known only that documentation was what careful people did. She was grateful now for the version of herself that had understood that without being able to explain it. April came with the particular quality of a month that had made up its mind. The sky on the Thursday she chose was clean and unhurried, the kind of blue that suggested the day had been decided before she woke up. She dropped Vera at school at 8:15 and stood at the car for a moment, watching her daughter walk through the entrance doors without looking back, a new thing that had started 3 weeks ago. The not looking back. The assumption that the world ahead was safe enough to enter without checking. Clementine had noticed the first time and felt the complicated feeling that came with being needed slightly less, which was not loss, but was adjacent to it and was also pride. She drove home on the back roads with the window down. In the kitchen she made coffee and stood at the east window and watched the garden. The beds she and Vera had turned in March were showing their first green thin rows of seedlings along the furrows they had planted together on a Saturday when it was still cold enough to see their breath. The wild corner at the fence line was already moving the perennials that had survived the years of abandonment, coming back on their own schedule, unbothered, operating on a calendar that had nothing to do with anyone's plans. She finished her coffee. She got the flashlight and the small pry bar from the mudroom. She put on her work boots, double-knotted. She opened the door at the back of the kitchen that led to the cellar stairs. The cellar was different from what it had been in October. The standing water was gone. The stone walls had been repointed. She had installed lights on a cable run that gave the space enough illumination to work in without mystery. It smelled of old stone and mineral cleanliness, the smell of a space that had been dry long enough to forget it had ever been otherwise. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the east wall. It looked like every other wall. That was the point. Millicent had written that the panel was invisible, set flush, the seam disappearing into the field stone around it. Clementine walked the length of the wall slowly, her fingertips trailing along the surface. The stone here was the same gray field stone as everywhere else in the cellar, mortared in irregular courses, the work of someone fitting what the land provided, rather than ordering uniformity from a catalogue. She found the seam 2/3 of the way down the wall, barely there, a line marginally finer than the mortar joints around it, running vertically for roughly 4 feet and then turning along the floor. She crouched down and pressed the lower left corner, holding the pressure for 3 full seconds. A soft sound, not a click, more like the release of something that had been held in tension for a very long time. A section of wall swung inward 6 inches and stopped. She held the flashlight through the opening. The woodworking bench was there, just as Millicent had described massive oak along the near wall, tools on hooks above it, the handles gray with dust. Below the bench 24 mason jars, their lids domed with the convex curve of seals that had held for 50 years, and on the surface of the bench, set apart from everything else, with a deliberateness that was visible even after all this time, a wooden box. Small, square, no clasp, no lock. Clementine pushed the door fully open. The hinges moved without resistance, oiled when they were built and still holding that care. She stepped inside. The air had the quality of a sealed place exhaling. Decades of stillness shifting when the door opened, the specific weight of undisturbed time releasing itself into the present. She went to the wooden box first. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had gone the ivory of long-stored fabric, was a single folded letter. The same cream stationery as the wall letter, the same precise handwriting. She almost set it aside to read later, to give herself a moment to prepare. Then she understood that she had been preparing since October, and that the preparation was complete. She unfolded the letter and read it standing in the low-ceilinged room with the flashlight in her other hand. The date at the top was March 1974, the morning Hiram had died. Millicent had written it because he had asked her to that week, when he could still speak clearly enough to ask. She had done it the way he asked, which was to put it here, where he put everything that mattered. Hiram had worked at a mining operation in Elko County, Nevada, from August 1940 to March 1941. A four-man partnership licensed its claim, filed properly. Hiram was not one of the four partners. He was a hired hand paid wages. He had left the employment in March of 1941 and come home to Millbrook County. He had not come home empty-handed. Millicent wrote he understood what he had done. He never pretended otherwise to me. He said he had taken something that was not entirely his to take at a time when he was not the man he intended to be, and that he had spent every year since trying to be that man instead. He built this house with those hands. He raised our children in these rooms. He said the house was his attempt at an honest accounting, and that he believed it was sufficient, and that he was not sure it was. She wrote he asked me to tell you the truth before you decided what to do with what you found. He said it is yours. He said the weight of it is yours too. He said he was sorry he could not resolve it himself. Clementine stood in the sealed room for a long time after she finished reading. She thought about a man building this house in 1941 with hands that were carrying something he could not put down and could not openly claim, getting the framing right, because he believed that if you got the framing right, everything else was fixable. Living in the space between what he had done and who he was trying to be for 33 years, until the morning his wife sat in this room and wrote down what he had not been able to say above ground. She thought about Millicent keeping that secret for 30 years after he died, leaving it in this room, not because she did not know what to do with it, but because she understood that some things needed to be given to the future with full information, rather than resolved in the present with half of it. She called Adelaide. Adelaide arrived that afternoon with a locked case she had brought from her office. She photographed the cavity, the bench, the tools, the jars, the box, the letter, in the same methodical sequence she brought to everything. Then she worked the padlock on the metal box Clementine had lifted from beneath the loose stone behind the bench. Clementine had not tried to open it herself. She had lifted it, felt the weight shift inside, carried it upstairs, and called Adelaide. That was the correct sequence, and she knew it without being told. The lock gave. Adelaide lifted the lid. Inside, in 2 even rows, were 22 bars of gold. Not coins, not the irregular nuggets and flattened pieces from the canvas pouch upstairs. These were something between raw material and processed form, small rectangular bars, cast by hand, their surfaces bearing the minor variations of work done without industrial equipment, each one stamped with a simple maker's mark that was not a mint designation, but something more particular, the identifier of a specific private assay operation. Adelaide photographed each bar individually. She weighed each one on a scale from her case and wrote the figures in her leather pad. She was quiet while she worked, which was how she was when she was assessing something carefully before she spoke. When she finished, she sat down across from Clementine at the kitchen table and said, "Here is what I know and what I'm going to find out." The research took 6 weeks. Adelaide worked with a Nevada historian who specialized in 20th century mining operations and with a records archivist at the Bureau of Land Management who had apparently handled variations of this inquiry before, which Clementine found both surprising and oddly settling. A metallurgist confirmed that the stamp on the bars was consistent with a private assay operation active in Elko County from 1938 to 1943. The operation had 4 licensed partners. Their names were on the original claim filing. Hiram Bellows was not among them, but all 4 partners had died without heirs by the mid-1980s. The claim had been formally relinquished to the BLM in 1944. No enforcement action had ever been filed against the operation or against any individual connected to it. The relevant federal statutes of limitation had run out before Clementine's mother was born. There was no surviving claimant. There was no active encumbrance. There was no legal mechanism by which anyone could assert a competing interest in what sat in the metal box on Adelaide's examination table. Adelaide said, "Your position is clean. Everything in that box is yours." She said it simply without preamble because there was no longer any reason for preamble. Clementine sat at the kitchen table and listened to it and then sat with it for a moment in the way you sat with things that had taken a long time to arrive. She thought about Hiram Bellows. She thought about a man who had carried a weight he could not put down and could not share, and had built a house above it, built it well, gotten the framing right, raised children in it, died in it, and left the truth in a sealed room for whoever came after. He had not resolved it. He had done something harder than resolving it. He had refused to pretend it did not exist, and he had trusted the future to do what he could not. The future had turned out to be her. She decided she was not going to judge him. She understood the distinction between a man's worst action and the life he built after it, and she understood it not abstractly, but from the inside, from the private knowledge of every choice she had made that she was not proud of, and the work she had done since to be a different version of herself. Hiram Bellows had gotten the framing right. That was the whole of what she could know about him that mattered, and it was enough. She gave notice at the medical billing office in June. Her manager, Corinne Blunt, who had supervised her for 6 of her 8 years there, stood at the door and said, "You've been somewhere else for months." "I have a house," Clementine said. "I'm going to build something in it." Corinne said, "Good. You were always too careful for this work. Careful people need something worth being careful about." She paid back every person she had borrowed from to assemble the $4,380 each one with interest. She calculated herself and added without being asked, because the interest was not the point. The point was that she had borrowed against trust, and the trust deserved the full return. She paid Josephine first. The pearl earrings came back in a padded envelope 6 weeks later. Josephine had found the buyer through the resale app's transaction history and had negotiated with the focused patience of someone who had decided the outcome before the conversation began. She had paid 3 times her opening offer without complaint. She had not asked Clementine before doing it. When the envelope arrived, Clementine opened it at the kitchen table and put the earrings in her palm and sat there for a while. Then she put them in the drawer of her bedside table and cried for about 10 minutes, which felt like exactly the right amount. She donated the 23 letters of Greta Stein to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Dr. Wendt handled the formal transfer. The museum credited Millicent Bellows' family and Clementine Kimball, finder and donor, in the documentation. Clementine kept a full translated copy for Vera, sealed in an envelope with a note on the outside that said, "When you are ready for this." The envelope went into the same drawer as the pearl earrings. She spent the summer expanding the garden into the western section of the property, turning the wild grass under and building raised beds from lumber she had learned to cut and join over the preceding months. The work had a different quality now than the desperate labor of the first weeks, no longer the frantic application of effort against an emergency, but the steady investment of someone working on something that was actually theirs. She and Vera planted in rows. Vera kept a second notebook alongside her bug documentation, which she called the house notebook, and which contained pencil drawings of each room with labels in her improving handwriting, and at the back a careful reproduction of Millicent's wall letter copied out in the handwriting of a 4-year-old who had looked at the original so many times she knew parts of it by heart. Clementine found the notebook one evening on the kitchen table. She opened it, read it, and put it back exactly where she had found it. She had the root cellar properly fitted out by August new shelving, adequate lighting the walls, finished the floor dry and level. The loose stone was reset in mortar flush with the others. Vera had designed a small wooden marker to place beside it a square of cedar with words carved in letters that Clementine had helped her trace. The marker read, "This is where the important things were kept." It stood at the edge of the spot where the stone had been, and it told the truth about what had happened there without requiring explanation. Neville Bellows arrived on a Friday in October. He was 63 years old, and he drove a rental car from the airport and pulled into the driveway and sat in it for a full minute before he opened the door, and Clementine watched him from the kitchen window and understood exactly what he was doing. He was letting the real version of the house replace the imagined one that had lived in his mind since Adelaide's letter had found him in Tucson in May. He was lean with white hair, and he moved with the particular economy of a person who had stopped wasting motion somewhere in his 50s. He had his grandmother's hands, she thought, the same deliberateness. She met him at the car, and they shook hands, and she said, "Welcome. I'm glad you came." She said it simply because it was simply true. He stood for a moment, looking at the house. At the porch, straight and solid, the new column where the old one had failed. At the windows, sealed and glazed. At the paint, the pale green that was almost gray in some lights and almost the color of new leaves in others, the color she and Vera had chosen together at the hardware store on a Saturday morning, Vera holding up swatches with the gravity of someone who understood that the choice had permanent consequences. She mentioned a color in one of her letters, Neville said. Not this one, an older one from when they first painted the house, but the instinct was the same. He looked at the paint. She wrote that a house should announce itself quietly and let what was inside speak louder. Clementine had not known about that letter. She stood beside him and felt Millicent's reach extending into a place she had not expected to find it. She showed him the kitchen first because it was the most alive room in the house, and because the east-facing window was there, and because she had made tea. He sat at the table she had found in the basement and restored, and he looked at the garden through the window with the attention of someone reading something important. She took him to the main bedroom last. The dresser stood against the far wall where she had moved it in March, its cracked mirror catching the afternoon light at an angle that turned the crack into something like a river on a map. The south wall was plain plaster, the wall-paper ending at the edges of the exposed section, and Millicent's handwriting was there in its faded amber ink patient and unhurried exactly where it had always been. Neville Bellows stood in front of it and read. He read the whole letter from the first line to the signature without speaking. Then he read it again, and this time he slowed at certain places, and Clementine could see in the particular stillness of his body which lines were landing differently. He stopped at the line about Roland. He stood there for a long moment, not moving. "She never talked about him," he said finally. His voice was even, but carrying something underneath it, the controlled weight of a man who had learned in 63 years to hold difficult things without letting them spill. "My mother told me Millicent would not hear Roland's name spoken after 1969. Would leave a room if someone brought him up. Everyone thought she had closed the door on it." He paused. "She wrote it on the wall." "She wrote it where no one could see it for 50 years," Clementine said. "I think that was how she carried things, not out loud." Howe was quiet. Then he said, "She writes about the November light through the east kitchen window. I've seen it twice. I bring Vera down for it." He looked at her then, the first fully direct look of the afternoon, and there was something in it that had been assembling itself since he had stepped out of the car and looked at the paint color his grandmother had chosen without knowing it. "She would have loved that," he said. "A little girl in this house who watches the light." Herschel Pruitt was on the porch when they came outside. He had not been invited and had not needed to be. He had seen the rental car in the driveway from his property and had walked down the road with 2 bottles of cider from the batch he had made in September, and he had settled himself into one of the porch chairs with the ease of a man who understood that some occasions simply required his presence without requiring an explanation of it. He shook Neville's hand and said, "Your grandmother made the right call, leaving the house to whoever needed it. Most people would have sold it for what they could get. She understood the house was worth more than any offer." Neville sat with that for a moment. "She didn't have family left to leave it to. My mother died in 2019. I think she felt the people she would have passed it to were already gone." "Then she passed it to the right person instead," Herschel said. He looked at Clementine with the expression of a man who had been watching a situation develop for a year and felt satisfied with how it had come out. Vera appeared at the porch door with her house notebook under her arm, evaluated the assembled adults with the comprehensive efficiency of a 4-year-old who had developed strong opinions about which conversations were worth joining, and settled cross-legged on the porch floor beside her mother's chair. She opened to the page she wanted, found her place, and began to draw. She was documenting the light the particular way the October afternoon came across the garden and caught the tops of the raised beds she had helped plant in the spring, the beds that had given them tomatoes and beans and squash through the summer and were now going quietly to their winter form. Neville watched her draw. He watched Clementine watch her. He looked at the garden, at the wild corner of the fence line, where the perennials had come back on their own time, at the property's edge, where the grass went long and gold in the afternoon. After a while he said, "She wrote in that last letter that she hoped whoever found what she left would make it a home." Clementine looked at the house behind them, at the straight porch and the sealed windows, and the paint that had been the right color from the moment they saw it on the sample board. She looked at the east-facing window, through which 3 weeks from now the November light would come in low and orange and fill the kitchen for 40 minutes, and she would be there to see it, and Vera would be there beside her, with her hands around a mug of hot chocolate, watching the room go gold. Vera looked up from her notebook without being called. She looked at Neville Bellows, then at her mother, then at the house, with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften what she saw. "She already knows," Vera said. "She left the letter so she'd know for sure." Neville Bellows looked at the 4-year-old on the porch floor, and then he turned his face slightly away, the way men did when they did not want to be seen in a particular moment, and he looked out at the garden and the golden light on the wild grass at the property's edge. Nobody said anything more. There was nothing more to say. The October light came across the whole length of the property, long and unhurried, the way it came in the last good weeks of the year, when it had the patience to reach all the way into the corners of things. It touched the tops of the raised beds and the old fence line, and the cedar marker at the edge of the root cellar door, where the important things had been kept. It touched the paint on the south wall of the house, and the cracked glass of the upstairs bedroom window, and the boards of the porch, where 4 people sat in the specific quiet of those who had arrived each by their own road at the same place at the same time. Inside on the plaster wall of the main bedroom, Millicent Bellows' handwriting waited in its faded amber ink, patient, permanent, already delivered. The house held everything it had always been built to hold. The framing was right. It had always been right. And now, after all the years and all the waiting, so was everything else.